Simon opened with, how can be so rude that they would persecute another person? I mean, if you go into Paul's life, Paul wrote half the New Testament. And if you go into his previous life, he was one of those same people that was persecuting the church. And I can't wrap my mind around, same as Simon, I can't wrap my mind around actually being like so dogmatic about my opinions and my ideas that then I would literally go throw rocks at somebody and like throw big rocks at somebody till they're dead. Yeah, till they're dead. Like, I can't wrap my mind around that. The Bible says, and I didn't look all these verses up, and this wasn't really what I was going to teach on. I texted Simon last night and I said, I got some notes on preaching today. Last night he called me and he said, hey, can you preach today? I think Will was on to preach, but they're in Texas. And I said, yeah, I'll plan on preaching. And later last night I texted him. I'm like, do you have something you're inspired on? Because I have notes, but I'm not inspired to preach these notes. And I have the notes right there, but I'm like, I don't feel inspired. So I just want to give you this little conversation. And so, like, I can't imagine persecuting somebody. Paul did it. Paul was there when Stephen was martyred. He was the first martyr that we know of, that we have account of in the Bible, that gave his life for Christ. And he held the clothes and watched it. And he continued to persecute the church. So much so that when he became converted later, there was talk under the church that said, I don't know if we can trust this guy yet. Like, wasn't he the guy that persecuted those people? And it took a little bit of time, and Paul had to persuade them. And he talked about the light that he got knocked down, and he had to persuade people. But there's a Bible verse, and I don't have reference to it right now. It says, and I believe this is what Paul was dealing with, and this is what people deal with still today. He said, I want to take your stony heart from you. You know what it says? I want to give you a heart of flesh, because the heart of flesh feels. When God changes your heart from a stony heart and he gives you a heart of flesh, maybe some of you have had dads in your life when you growing up, that you hated your dad when you were 16 years old and 15 years old and 14 years old. I don't know. Maybe you struggled to like him. Maybe you wanted to hurt your dad. But now you have a heart of flesh, and that same heart only has a desire to see there's a softness that you feel towards your dad. You forgive those things in your past, and you wish him a better life, and you have a love towards him, and you don't want to hurt him anymore. That's because God took that stony heart from you, and he gave you a heart of flesh. And he did the same thing to Paul. He took that stony heart from Paul. He gave him a heart of flesh. I know people in my own family that they had stony hearts. They were concerned about the religion than they were about Christianity. And I've seen God change some of those people in my family, not my brothers or my dad, but some of my extended relatives, that I've seen God change their hearts just like Paul. Just like Paul. And now they have a heart of flesh, and they want to see the gospel get better and further. I remember when my dad and mom left the Amish, one of my dad's brothers said it would have been easier if there would have been a funeral. And for about 3 years, he had a very stony heart, very judgmental. And then God got a hold of him in one reunion. I remember he'd come to the reunion, and I told Deb, something happened with him. We sat around and talked about the Bible, and he had this love. You know what I'm talking about? Just this love coming from him. I could feel it. He's not the same man. Got converted, and he quit pushing his own agenda, and he said, let's push the Jesus agenda. And that's what happened to Paul as well. And I believe this is a key, and we skimmed over this verse in Romans chapter 3. It says, there is no fear of God before their eyes. This is in verse 18, and it says, their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. They slander and they gossip and they talk about other people, and they want to only destroy men of God. They want to gossip about these people. It says their feet are swift to shedding blood. This is what we talked about. They would people. Honestly, there's still people like that. I know we probably don't experience a lot of persecution here. There's actually still a lot of persecution going across the world. Actually, probably worse today than it's ever been in the history of mankind. People that are dying for their faith in other countries. Ruin and misery marks their ways. They're mean, evil people. The way of peace they do not know. And then 18, we kind of skimmed over this verse, says, there is no fear of God before their eyes. That's why. And so let's just look at a couple people that I think had the fear of God in their lives. I won't much. I want you young people, I want you to really pay attention to these examples of the fear of God, because the fear of God is what produces good works. Okay? You get saved, you give your heart to Jesus, and then that fear of God is what produces good works. You're going to stop saying, well, Dad's not going to find out. And you're going to start saying, oh, God sees everything I do. We can get by with things around each other. I can do something and hope Aiden doesn't find out, or vice versa, or Simon. But Aiden finding out doesn't matter. Simon finding out doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. What matters is that God sees everything. And the fear of God is what changes all of that. Anybody know who Joseph was in the Bible? Growing up, that was probably my favorite story. I remember going to Groeskmia. It's communion. Who remembers communion as the Amish little boys, right? Who attended communion as an Amish boy? Remember? Were those long Sundays for you guys as well? My favorite part about those Sundays was always we'd pack our own lunch. Yeah, we always did. I don't know about y'all, but we always packed our own lunches. And then at the lunch break, so they would have church for 3 hours. Then lunch break, we would sit with our friends and eat our picnic lunches. Usually what we had sandwiches or something. And sometimes maybe we'd trade with somebody because my buddy's was better and he thought mine was better. That was the highlight of communion for me growing up as a 14-year-old boy. But I remember them going through these stories, and the Joseph story, I always liked the Joseph story. But Joseph truly feared the Lord. There's a couple things in the Joseph story. Joseph, we can read that story in about 2 minutes. We read that whole story, the story of Joseph's life from when he was a young man, just a young man watching the sheep, to he getting sold, he getting thrown in the pit, and he's getting sold because of the jealousy of his brothers, and he gets sold into slavery, and he ends up in Potiphar's house. And then he's tempted with Potiphar's wife. He could have easily said, Potiphar's probably not going to find out. He could have easily said that, but he didn't. Joseph actually says, he could have said, Potiphar might find out. He could have said, this could ruin my reputation. This might cost my job. But he didn't say any of those things. You know what he said? He said it would be a sin against God. Why did he say that? Because he had the fear of God in his life. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom in all of these things. And all of these things. I'm human just like all of you. We're all human. We're tempted. There's things that come our way. Maybe it's anger or lust or whatever it is in your life that you're tempted. And when we have the fear of God in our lives, we can say like Joseph, yeah, I might be able to do this and not get found out, but it would be a sin against God. That's what the fear of God produces. Joseph lived with a deep awareness that God was watching. Proverbs 14, verse 27 says, the fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, turning a person from the snares of death. Isn't that something? The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life. The fear of God gives you the courage to do what is right. It gives you a lot of wisdom in decision making. You know that? It gives you a lot of wisdom in decision making. Gives you a hatred for evil. Let's look at Peter's story just a little bit. I think Peter's story is pretty cool, like how Peter became a disciple. Does anybody know, like, how did that whole journey start? You know the story, but does it come to mind? How did Peter's journey start? It's in Luke chapter 5. Peter had been fishing all night and he caught nothing. Remember that story? He was out fishing all night. He caught nothing. He was tired and frustrated. I'm just going to read through this little story. Fishing was his profession, and this had been a long, unsuccessful night. Y'all know how it is to be up on Lake Erie all day. I've been there. Fished hard and caught 2 of them. I'm like, man, I know they're here. Jesus came to the shore and asked Peter if he could use his boat to teach the crowd. Peter came in. He wasn't a disciple at this point. Jesus comes up and your boat. I want to preach to this crowd. So he lets him. When Jesus finished teaching, he said something unexpected. He said, Peter, let's go out in the deeper water and let your nets down to catch some fish. Peter was probably thinking, I'm the fisherman here, and we're already tired of that. But Peter responded with obedience, because you say, he said, I will let down the nets. When they lowered the nets, something incredible happened. The nets filled with so many fish, they began to break. Another boat had to come and help, and both boats were filled almost to sinking. At that moment, Peter realized something. This was not just a teacher. This was the power of God standing in the boat. How cool would that have been? Right? When Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' feet and said, go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man. Haven't we all been there? That was the fear of God, probably for the first time in Peter's life. But Jesus recognized that in Peter. Because when you are on your knees and you recognize, I'm a sinful man, that's when God can use you. Peter suddenly became aware of God's holiness and his own sinfulness. This is what the fear of God looks like. It's a moment when someone realizes God is holy, God is powerful, God is real. And that realization produces humility. And that's what Jesus is looking for. None of us are perfect because of our own works. Remember, wisdom and the fear of God is what produces the works. But on your own, Jesus ain't opening the doors of heaven when you die and says, come on in. It's only through what he's done for us, and that brings humility. But notice what Jesus said next. Jesus did not reject Peter. Instead, he said, don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people. He says, I'm going to make you fishers of men. That moment changed Peter's life forever. The Bible says they left everything and followed him. That was Peter's journey. How cool is that? He's ministering, and then he goes, hey, guys, you know how I got to meet this Jesus guy? He said, I was fishing. I didn't catch nothing all night. And then he told me, right? And he told them the story. I'm sure he told people that story. Doesn't record it that he said that, but I'm pretty sure I would have been saying that story a lot. Paul said the story a lot, how he met Jesus. Bright light shone down. I know I persecuted some of you, but that's not what I'm doing anymore. When we truly encounter God, 3 things happen. We see God's holiness, we see our own need, and our life direction changes. Proverbs 9 says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Many people today try to remove the fear of God from faith, but the truth is, when we truly see God for who he is, reverence naturally fills our heart. That reverence changes the way we live, just like Peter. One moment with Jesus turned an ordinary fisherman into a man who would change the world. Isn't that something? He was just an ordinary guy fishing. Paul actually wasn't really an ordinary guy. I mean, he was an ordinary guy, but he was persecuting the church. And here you have 2 people that the fear of God changed their entire lives forever. They were a very sinful people. They were a very human person. They were very, like look at Paul's life. You would never have thought, man, that's God's going to really spread the gospel. But he was an amazing messenger for the word. And so, look in your own lives, you know. None of us are perfect. But the fear of God is what brings wisdom. And he says, I want to take your stony heart and I want to change it, and I want to give you a heart of flesh. That's a heart that loves when it should hate. Everything in the Bible is almost backwards. It says if you want to be first, be the last. If you want to be the best, leaders serve the best. Like, Jesus' way is so different from the world's way. But I really believe that, the fear of God, I know, is the beginning of wisdom. And so I would tell all of us, pray for wisdom, especially you young people. Pray that God gives you wisdom. Not just you young people, but I believe young people need it. We all need wisdom. And He wants to give you direction in your lives to live your best lives. So I don't know. I'll turn it back to Simon.